Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is co-sponsored by the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs, the Department of Sociology, Africana Studies, and the Center of the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. And my name is Nadje, and I'm the Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Middle East Studies and Anthropology. And it's my great pleasure to host today's event. You can follow us on hashtag DuBoisSoc, that's hashtag DuBoisSoc. We are live streaming this event on the Watson website, and you can point to those friends and colleagues who are unable to join the webinar because we are oversubscribed. And they can join us at watson.brown.edu.live. That's watson.brown.edu.live. I will introduce our speakers in a moment, but just to let you know the format of today's event, we'll be in conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A, and you can either use the Q&A function on the webinar, or if you're watching us on YouTube, the YouTube function. At this point, I'm very happy to introduce to you first the two co-authors of the book that we are discussing today. And this is, of course, we're celebrating the publication of the Sociology of W. Du Bois, Racialized Modernity, and the Global Color Line. So the co-authors are Jose Itzigsohn and Karida L. Brown. Jose Itzigsohn is Professor of Sociology at Brown University. He is the author of Developing Poverty, Encountering American Fault Lines, and now, of course, the co-author of the book that we're going to discuss today. Karida L. Brown is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Africana and American Studies at UCLA. She is the author of Gone Home, Race and Roots Through Appalachia. And I'm really, really pleased that we're also joined by Professor Nicole Gonzalez von Cleve, who is an associate professor in sociology at Brown University. Professor Gonzalez von Cleve is the author of Crook Country, Racism and Injustice in America's Largest Criminal Court and the Waiting Room. Nicole, over to you to kick us off with the discussion, please.
Well, it is so great to see everybody, and thank you to everyone who's logged on for this amazing day. So here is the book. I want to first thank the authors here, Jose and Karida. This book is just so wonderful. And as we get into it, in sociology, I was trained in Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Simmel. And I think that was about it. I mean, we read Goffman, we read, some modern works, but really Du Bois was left out of the conversation. And as a scholar of color, that really struck me as negligent, in all honesty. And one of the most wonderful things that I love about this book is that you bring Du Bois back into the conversation, back into the discipline of sociology. And for me as a scholar, it was wonderful reading this beautifully written and accessible preface where you talk about how you both kind of personally and academically found Du Bois. So maybe we'll start with Jose. Tell us a little bit about that personal journey that you write about to bring your readers and all students of sociology into Du Bois's journey.
Yes, first of all, thanks Nadje and Nicole for being today with us, talking about the book. Yeah, my experience was not different than yours. In my PhD, I think I got a very good training as a researcher, but I never heard or read Du Bois. I left graduate school without knowing about Du Bois. Mm-hmm. My first job was in a visiting teaching position at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And there I found that the library is named after Du Bois and that the library houses the Du Bois archives. And just being a curious person, I wanted to know who Du Bois was. And I started to read about Du Bois and I started to read Du Bois. And at that point, it dawned on me that I was missing the work of one of the founders of sociology, perhaps the most important of the founders of sociology. So I started to read Du Bois. I started to teach Du Bois, first to undergraduates, then to graduates. It was a long process. Today, I'm happy that I teach a full graduate seminar on Du Bois. And that encounter with Du Bois at UMass Amherst also, started the process that led to this book that Karida and I wrote. And in this book, we want to do a couple of things. First is to introduce the discipline to the full scope of Du Bois' work. We argue that Du Bois was a sociological theorist and that he developed a unique sociological approach based on a critique of what we call racialized modernity. Our second goal is to start a conversation about the implications of Du Bois' work for us today, building a Du Boisian sociology today. And me personally, in writing this book, I hope that current students and future students will not have to go through the process of discovering Du Bois that I went. That in writing this book, we wanted to provide a tool to students through which they can approach the work of Du Bois and realize its importance for sociology.
Thank you. And what about Karida? How did you find Du Bois personally?
Well, I first found Du Bois during my time in graduate school at Brown. And looking back, that was actually late for me personally, given that I grew up in a majority Black neighborhood in Long Island, New York. I attended a majority Black elementary and high school with majority Black faculty, most of whom hailed from this country's top historically Black colleges and universities. So, in hindsight, I thought I would have been introduced to him by one of my teachers. But fast forward to graduate school, ironically enough, although I was in a PhD program in sociology, I first encountered Du Bois in Professor Tony Bogues' class in the Africana Studies department. And this was during my second year of graduate school. Had it not been for that, I might have gotten through my program without encountering Du Bois in a formal way. But in this class, that's when I first read The Souls of Black Folk. And that book stirred my soul. It resonated with me so deeply. And you can just imagine how surprised I was to learn that Du Bois was, in fact, a sociologist. So around the same time that I was discovering Du Bois, I learned that Jose also had an interest in his works. We had a few conversations about this, and soon after, he generously invited me to co-author an article with him on Du Bois's theory of double consciousness. That began our years-long journey of discovering and learning the sheer breadth and depth and genius of Du Bois's system of thought. And Jose, I think I can speak for us both in saying that this process of reading his body of published and unpublished works was nothing short of humbling, because he wrote so much. One of our goals with this book was to synthesize Du Bois's oeuvre so we could leave our readers with something akin to a treasure chest of his lesser known work. What it is, in what context Du Bois published it, and where one can find it should they be interested. So in that way, the citational traces of this book are just as important as the main text itself.
And I think that, it was interesting. I was laughing with my students. They were asking, we were joking about Marx or, theory and what books you read when you're a first year graduate student. I'm like, well, I read Marx. I read the red Marx Engels Reader. Remember that? And so, I feel like this is kind of the answer, which is this book, I hope, will be that connection so graduate students in the future don't have to fight so hard. And so that, it will be the reader that go-to book on Du Bois that sociologists can tap into as almost essential to being a sociologist. So I just want to move and just think about Du Bois's contribution. I always think of Durkheim as solidarity, Marx is class, Weber is rationalization and bureaucracy, not to summarize too quickly. But Du Bois was kind of the first person to say it was race and racism and colonialism that constructed the modern world, and that was really the centerpiece. That was just such the brilliance of him integrating his lived experience, but also his empirical experience, his experience as a researcher. So can you talk a little bit about that orientation, but also how did he balance being a researcher, but also someone that wanted to kind of undo the color line and advance causes of the oppressed at the same time? It would start with Karida first on that one.
Okay. So Du Bois reflected on this very question in an essay he penned in 1944 titled My Evolving Program for Negro Freedom. And I'm just going to quote a piece of that essay when he's reflecting on the early him back in 1894 when he was just finishing his graduate program in Germany. And he reflects saying, I returned ready and eager to begin a life work leading to the emancipation of the American Negro. History and the other social sciences were to be my weapons, to be sharpened and applied by research and writing. Where and how was the question in 1894, close quote. So Du Bois's sociological thought evolved over time, and in some ways quite drastically. We document that in this book, his evolving thought. However, one thing that remained constant is that he was always an emancipatory sociologist. So we bracketed his evolving thought into 4 eras. So in his early years, from 1894 to about 1910, he truly believed that facts and science alone would be enough to undo the color line. But he thought that by proving to his oppressors that there was in fact no science behind inherent racial inferiority, and he was quite naive in this belief. But this is the Du Bois that most of us as sociologists are socialized to know through the discipline. And this is the Philadelphia Negro Du Bois that many of us come to encounter. However, that was actually a very short period of time in his nearly 70-year career. So by the time he left Atlanta University for the first time in 1910, he had done away with that idea of relying strictly on facts and science and letting his published research stand on its own. He still believed in the power of sociological science. He never gave that up. But he came to the conclusion that media and what he termed propaganda, not in this sense of stretching the truth, but in propagating an idea and getting it out into the masses, that these things were necessary vehicles to change the hearts and minds of the public. This was also the period that Du Bois turned his focus away from the talented 10th and begins to engage the masses in a serious way. This is the era where we see Du Bois turn to organizing with the Pan-African Congress, the NAACP, founding a Black theater company in Harlem, and even founding a children's magazine so he could reach Black children. The third era was just before the Great Depression, around 1928. And this was marked by Du Bois's return to Atlanta University and his focus on building Black economic cooperatives. Importantly, this was the period when Du Bois also begins grappling seriously with Marx. And here we get Black Reconstruction in America and a revival of the Atlanta University studies. In the fourth and last era, from World War II to the end of his career and life, Du Bois turned to socialism and digs deeper into his Pan-Africanism, where he's a full-blown internationalist. And in addition to his continued publications, he begins to attend World Peace Congresses and becomes a leader in this movement. And for this, he was ultimately indicted by the Department of Justice for failure to register as a foreign agent. So that affair was definitely a low point in Du Bois's life. And soon after he was able to leave the United States because his passport was revoked for years, he then immigrated to Ghana upon the invitation of President Kwame Nkrumah, where he spent the rest of his life. But again, what is constant through these eras of Du Bois's evolving thought and action is that he never wavered in his aim to undo the color line. While his means may have varied, the end was always the same, and that was emancipation.
Jose, would you like to add to that?
Oh, sorry.
Or?
Yeah, I'll just add, emphasize what Karida said at the end. Throughout his life, Du Bois was concerned with emancipation. He thought about what that meant, change, or how to achieve that change. But throughout his life, his concern was emancipation. Throughout his life, he aimed to use scientific knowledge for emancipation. He emphasized that science should aim for the truth, but also that the search for the truth should be, the goal of it should be emancipate humanity. And the other constant is that from the very beginning, his thought was global. He thought in global terms. And from the very beginning, his thought was anti-racist and anti-colonial. So those are the constants within the large degree of change that Karida very well described.
Yeah. Well, like Nicole, I also really enjoyed the book and found it not only extremely accessible, but very instructive. One of the things that I liked was the emphasis on context. I mean, you both make it very clear that context matters, history matters, and that is sort of against the wider trend that I see sometimes in the social sciences of sort of ahistorical analysis, what I call sort of presentism. Maybe it's more acute in media discourses and policy discourses when we talk about inequality and racism. And I see it a lot in the context of my work on the Middle East, this very ahistorical approach. Yes, my question to you then is, what was the significance of historical analysis for Du Bois, and why does it matter for contemporary sociology? Jose, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, history and historical analysis were really central to Du Bois' thought and Du Bois' sociology. I mean, he emphasized that any social analysis should start with the history of whatever we study, and social analysis also should take into account the historical moment in which we are living, or in which the historical moment in which that we are analyzing, the specificities and particularities of that historical period. And Du Bois really proposed a sociology rooted in history, which is not a historical sociology. It's a sociology that takes history into account. And we argue that, in a sense, Du Bois sociology is a critique of a historical period that we describe as racialized modernity, and it's a critique of a particular historical system and its many manifestations through geography and through history, which is racial and colonial capitalism. And this is very different from the way mainstream American sociology works. I mean, mainstream American sociology mainly analyzes one case, American society. Du Bois also was an analyst of American society, but he always put American society in its global context and in its global history. He starts Black Reconstruction by saying that the Civil War is but a chapter of a larger history, and by putting the economy of the South in the context of the global economy of the time. And when American sociology goes comparative, it usually, not always, I mean, I'm talking about the general, it looks at national societies as separated and unrelated to each other. Du Bois' method was looking at the relations between the different social processes in different geographies. He emphasized the importance of analyzing local context and local specificity, but in relation to the global processes and to global histories. So it's a very different approach to the one that developed in American sociology and in sociology in general, that really starts with Max Weber and the development of ideal types and an attempt to look at historical cases, and look at patterns across historical cases without accounting for historical specificity, even though Weber's own work really was embedded in historical specificity. Yeah. So Du Bois proposes a very different relation between, sociology and history, and we believe that a contemporary Du Boisian sociology ought to return to this Du Boisian methodology and embrace really an embeddedness in history and in context.
Yes. Karida, would you like to add to this?
I would just add that throughout the book, we demonstrate how Du Bois puts that methodological centrality of history and action through his entire body of work over time. But he really laid out the blueprint for how and why the philosophy of science behind his methodology in his early writings. And I'll specifically point to his 1898 article, The Study of Negro Problems, where he really specifies why history is so central, and how the social scientists can employ that to not only ask better questions, but to then have explanatory power that is not eliding context and time.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to maybe bring it back a little bit to thinking about Du Bois and then also the discipline of sociology right now. So I'm thinking about Alden Morris's exceptional work, The Scholar Denied, and I'm wondering, you know, we all started this discussion saying, wow, we have not really used Du Bois and thought of him as or many scholars have not thought of him as a founding father of sociology, and yet we see how the breadth of his work, how exceptional it was. And so I'm wondering how much has really changed within our field. You know, many graduate students will come to me and say they have advisors in different departments and all different places, pushing them away from studying racism or away from decolonial approaches. And so, you know, what are your thoughts about the state of the field and how we can move it forward? And what messages does Du Bois have for us now in this time?
Well, I'll take a...
Yeah, we'll start with Jose, sorry.
I mean, it is as you described. Yes, the main canon of sociology is mostly composed of white males from Europe or North America. Mm-hmm. That is slowly changed, but it hasn't changed. And the canonical theories of the sociological canon write about the societies of Europe and North America, and about the historical experience of Europe and North America, as if they were universal experience. And they write without addressing the connections of those histories with the histories and experiences of other parts of the world, and also without connecting the histories of those societies with the particular experiences that minoritized groups have in those societies. So it is a very limited perspective. It's in a sense a provincial perspective, in the sense that it is limited to a certain historical experiences that is passed on as a universal history, as a universal experience. We argue that Du Bois, writing from the margins of North America, was proposing a different kind of sociology, a sociology written from the perspective of the oppressed, written from the perspective of the marginalized, a sociology that looks at modernity as racialized modernity, and that looks at capitalism as racial and colonial capitalism. So in analyzing capitalism, Du Bois starts from the perspective of the colonized and enslaved person, as opposed to Marx, who starts from the perspective of factory workers, or Weber, who starts from the perspective of bureaucrats and entrepreneurs. So that provides a different view of society, and it challenges the understanding of modernity that mainstream sociology has, that takes a particular provincial experience as a universal one. So we believe that Du Boisian sociology ought to embrace that and continue that line of research and build a sociology that looks at the world from the perspective of the oppressed, the marginalized, the exploited, and there are many different experiences. They're not one, there are many different standpoints and perspectives. But that's the way from where we should start thinking about the present and thinking about and starting our social analysis.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we'll turn this question to Karida as well, but I also feel then it does offer a different set of questions if you're studying those who create the conditions of marginality, meaning you're studying the power brokers, and that gives you a certain lens to push studies of power, right, in different directions. What about both directions, Karida? So on the one hand, from the perspective of those who might be marginalized by these racial systems, but then the other side of power. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So I'll start with just how I was then socialized into the discipline with the canon. And I just resonated so much with what you said about encountering grad students who disappointingly experience their work being discredited or eschewed by faculty, discouraging them from studying racism, colonialism, and from producing theory from a subaltern standpoint. That was, for the most part, my experience. Thank you, Jose, for saving me from that. Jose was my dissertation advisor, for those of you who didn't know. But, you know, when you first come into the discipline of sociology, if you're not with that mainstream white guy perspective, solely as a universal place of knowing, then it is very difficult. So I came to understand very early on in my socialization into the discipline that the canon consisted of white guys. Real theory was produced by white guys. Objective sociology was that which was produced from what the late great Toni Morrison says, from the position of a white gaze. Scholarship from other standpoints, from a subaltern standpoint, from a Black standpoint, from a feminist standpoint, from a non-Judeo-Christian standpoint, was met with suspicion, and was considered like a lesser order of thinking. That's a huge barrier before you can even get to your work, right? So one gets these messages explicitly. You get them through the curricula and reading assignments on syllabi. And quite frankly, you pick them up explicitly also from faculty composition in departments and messages of prestige. You also get these messages tacitly through slights and silence. And that is something that a Du Boisian sociology as a network of self-identified scholars moving in this way, this is where it becomes so powerful. And to your question about speaking to power, that subaltern standpoint in theorizing the powerful is so insightful and powerful. And that is something that Du Bois did with depth. His sociology was always a multi-level sociology where he could theorize from a subaltern standpoint, but bring that up to macro level systems and structures. And in that way, he was able to not only identify and specify the mechanisms of power and their social relations, but also to critique them and dismantle the logics that undergird them. And that is something that power writ large never likes. That is to be exposed and have the architecture and blueprint of those logics exposed. And that today, like in Du Bois's times today, comes down, bears a lot of criticism for scholars who dare do that, but it is important to do that work.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the issue of standpoint and positionality, you know, which you've addressed. I mean, to my mind, not only does the work of Du Bois challenge the idea of this objective knowledge production, which we know historically has been from the vantage point of white middle-class men, but in terms of positionality and the importance of experience, Du Bois is also juggling being an academic, a scholar, and an activist. And, you know, many of us who are juggling this, you know that there are certain challenges, but I have to say that I don't think I've ever been asked as often how I'm juggling, you know, between being a scholar and activist and when I came to the US. And so students often ask me this, so how do you manage, you know, how do you manage being a scholar and an activist? And so I would like to ask you both, So how would Du Bois have answered that question, and how do you answer it? So Karida, would you like to kick us off here?
You know, I would say Du Bois didn't even stop to consider that this would be a contradiction. He was, like we said, always an emancipatory sociologist. He made his intents clear. And especially as his thinking evolved and he became involved with the NAACP as editor of the Crisis magazine and an organizer of the Pan-African Congress, instead of a contradiction between scholar and activist, and I will also include that title of an organizer, he saw all of these things as mutually informing one another. So when I hear, those whispers or even outright assertions like, oh, that person is not really a scholar, they're an activist. And when that's presented in a pejorative way, I ask myself, what happened to us as scholars where it's been inculcated in our minds that it's more desirable, more prestigious, more worthy to be an inactivist? Are we working our butts off as sociologists to identify social problems and then just to stare at them? So Du Bois gave us examples of multiple ways for us to take our work as scholars to serve emancipatory aims, one of which was simply just the work of translation. He continually translated his findings from his research into mediums that were accessible to lay audiences. And this is so important. He found ways to make sure that his ideas were distributed widely to a global public. And examples of this, I keep going back to the Crisis. At the time that publication opened, it had the largest subscribership of any Black magazine in the country, and it had a global distribution. So Du Bois was articulating, his theory of double consciousness. He was articulating the problem of the color line is the problem of the 20th century, not in academies. He broke it down and spoke to a lay audience. He also did this through a number of novels that he penned. He opened a Black theater company in Harlem in the 1930s. He was doing all of this and more while still publishing in top academic journals and in book publication outlets that were at the top of his game during his time. So we too can take a page from his script on that.
Yes. Yeah. Jose?
Yeah, Du Bois theorized from his experience, which was the experience of a Black person born in the North a few years after the Civil War, that studied and lived in the South, studied also in Germany, traveled around the world. And those experiences led him to realize the many forms and manifestations of the color line worldwide. And those experiences allow him to theorize things that his other colleagues could not see, like double consciousness and the racialization of subjectivity, or the racial and colonial character of capitalism. And those experiences also led him down the path of critical theory. He says in Dusk of Dawn that if it wasn't for race, he would have, and race and racism, he would have been an apologist of the American system. But it was his experience that showed him that some things were not working. And it was also those experiences that led him to understand that the goal of science is really to emancipate people. And if the goal of science is to emancipate people, you have to be also a public sociologist and an activist. And he was the three things, an academic sociologist and a theorist, a public sociologist, and an activist during all his life. And it was a perfectly consistent and coherent life based on, starting to think based on those experiences. And when you start to build the sociology from the margins, the question of activism becomes, the answer to the question of activism becomes an obvious one, because otherwise what is the purpose of producing knowledge if not to change the conditions of marginalization? And we, in the book, we try to argue for a Du Boisian sociology that embraces that perspective. And Karida and I and a number of other people have created the Du Boisian Scholar Network to bring Du Boisian scholars who also embrace this perspective and also try to develop a theoretical and research agenda that is Du Boisian.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I was, just off of what you both said, I was thinking if there's a time, especially given all that's going on in the world right now, the sociologists need to speak out with and contribute to a dialogue. It's to stay silent. To me, I've written about this is a type of sociological malpractice. And so Du Bois was pushing kind of a moral compass of the discipline. So this feels so relevant to what we're all thinking about right now. I want to ask this as a kind of a personal question, which is many people are talking about decolonializing, a decolonialized discipline of sociology. And as someone who wasn't trained in Du Bois while in grad school, this was a really foreign concept to me. So can you describe a little bit about what that vision is and the Du Boisian roadmap for it, but also maybe engage race scholars who study racism and race in America, but really exclude the decolonial perspective? Like, what are they missing? So these are groups that should be more allied. So maybe we'll start with, should we start with Karida on this one? Or do we start, I'm sorry.
If I can interject, because
yeah, of course.
there's a question here that I think is relevant. It's a question by Zahra Ali, who asked, from your understanding of Du Bois sociology, what is your reading of Aníbal Quijano's work and of the decolonial school of thinking? Can you reflect on the relationship between post-colonial and decolonial theoretical perspectives? I think that sort of feeds in there. Personally, I was going to add sort of on back of your question, the question of US centrism, because I think that to my mind, reading Du Bois, he was challenging US centrism, but I get the feeling that that is not always the case in the way that he is received in the US. And I have to say, one of the things that, again, I noticed quite a bit coming to the US is how US-centric academia is. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. I think, Karida, you were going to start.
Great, thank you.
I'll be really brief here. These are all, as a set of questions, huge and deserve quite a bit of time, action, and meditation. But there's just so much to be done in this project of decolonizing sociology and the social science disciplines. It is important to remember our origin stories as, practitioners in these disciplines, as, the history of the social sciences in America as a late 19th and early 20th century formation, were largely in service to nation building, philanthropic objectives, which were a proxy for industrial barons, right? And for imperialism. So the impulse to look at both the citizen and the subject was in service to. So one part is doing that work of asking the question, how was the discipline colonized in the first place? Okay, and Alden Morris's Scholar Denied and Earl Wright's book, The Atlanta Sociological Laboratory, are exemplar of this type of work. It is there that we start that recontextualization of what the discipline even is for, and what the origin stories are, because there you start to see the Holes and Elijans. And this is why Du Bois himself privileged history. I'll also say that specifically to your question, Nadje, it is imperative that we decenter the epistemological nationalism that is inherent to this US-centric approach to knowledge building. There's one way to speak truth to power and to spend one's whole career critiquing an existing power structure, epistemological hegemony. That is important work. It is also a distraction from building a system of knowledge that is in service to other aims, particularly emancipatory aims. So I'll say to that, don't spend too much time responding to the discipline. Our efforts in this moment should be towards building one and continuing to build in that emancipatory decolonial frame. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Jose?
Yes, there were a lot of things in that question. I'll try to answer some of them at least. The last chapter of the book that we called A Manifesto for Du Boisian Sociology tries to articulate an alternative vision for sociology. And it's really an invitation to a conversation about how really to move forward. And, you know, personally, I see people coming from decolonial, post-colonial perspectives, critical race perspectives, racial formation perspectives, as all a community of people looking to articulate different ways of doing things that need to engage in a dialogue, coming from different histories, different perspectives, but with the same aim as challenging the ways that the social sciences and humanities work. So it's a kind of invitation to a dialogue to move forward together. The vision that we articulate there is that, in a sense, a sociology-based, theoretically in the understanding the presence as racialized modernity with all its implications, and methodologically based on 4 principles. One, the principle of contextuality, that analyzing the specific contextual and historical specificities of places in our analysis. The principle of historicity, that is embedding local histories in the analysis of the historical moment, that is racialized modernity, which changes over time how it works. Then the question of relationality. Yes, we analyze places in specificity, but in relation to larger global processes. And that addressed Nadje's point about the US centrism of the US Academy. Du Bois, from the very beginning, was a global thinker and understood and conducted very detailed analysis of specific locations, but always keeping in mind the larger context and the historical moment. And, you know, to your question, Nicole, in a sense, there is a lot of very good critical work on race that look at the United States without looking at colonialism and larger processes. That's very good work and is really advancing American sociology. But if we are going to understand, I mean, the Du Boisian, the perspective of Du Bois, and we think the Du Boisian perspective is, if we are to understand race in Brazil or in the United States or in Mexico or in anywhere, we need to look at how local histories are connected to broader global processes without reducing the specificity of the locality to a global, but also without detaching them. So Du Bois' perspective in that sense was always global, and it's throughout his writings. So the final methodological point is one that we have talked already, is the subaltern standpoint. And there is not only one subaltern standpoint, there are many subaltern standpoints, but looking at the world from the perspective of the oppressed, which doesn't mean not looking at the powerful. In a sense, it forces us to look at the structures of power and the powerful. I mean, your work is a great example of how to do that. I mean, your analysis of how the courts and the justice system works. So that's our proposal for reconstruction of sociology. But it really is an invitation to talk with decolonials, post-colonials, critical race theories about how we move together. I mean, entering into the question how it's different from Quijano or similar. I mean, I'm an admirer of the work of Aníbal Quijano, and I think that the idea of coloniality is one that we should, the coloniality of power and understanding the coloniality of the present is one that we should embrace in constructing a new Boisian sociology, but enter into an in-depth analysis of, you know, difference and points in common. I think it would take us, I mean, it's a topic for a whole conversation, not for a short answer.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to now pick up another question from the audience. Our colleague, Gary Augusto, asked, listening to Karida just now, I'm reminded of how beautiful, accessible, and ahead of his time were those almost Art Deco graphics Du Bois created on the Black social condition for the Paris Expo. And Gary's asking you whether you could speak more of how Du Bois challenges received notions in social science today about evidence-based, read statistics and modeling work. So in terms of, you know, so what do we learn from Du Bois in terms of methodology and methods? So I'd like to start here.
Oh, that's a beautiful question. I dare say that Du Bois was promiscuous when it came to what he considered data, methods, and presentation of those findings. And I use that word promiscuous in that he did not have a taxonomy that included some hierarchy of what high knowledge was. If he could invoke something to present his findings, he would do so. So using the Paris exhibition, the graphs that Du Bois produced for those, they are beautifully designed, and intentionally so, because they were designed for Du Bois and his collaborators to display at the Paris exhibition, which got over 4 million viewers attending that event in 1900. So he understood that aesthetics mattered. So he took that statistical population data and presented it in a way that was also so beautiful to the eye that it just drew in an audience. For that exhibition, Du Bois and his collaborators won a gold medal for their category. And it speaks to that. But you can see through all of Du Bois's kind of what I would call his public productions, he puts as much weight into aesthetics, presentation, accessibility to the particular audience to which he's speaking. That is a part of his, I would call it the way he moves with his methodology. It has a certain Du Bois swag to it that has a high aesthetic value. Du Bois was serious when it came to data and data analysis. He was one of the early mixed method sociologists who both mastered statistical analysis, interpretive theory, historical analysis. However, his was not, those methods were not in contradiction to one another, nor did he privilege one to the kind of denunciation of another. They were all kind of integrated into a soup instead of a hierarchical ladder.
So we have so many great questions. So we'll try to tackle one more before another question that I have. So from Dabahan Rachadari, I hope I pronounced that right, so please excuse me, says, thank you for sharing this amazing work. Can you tell us some background on the book cover? It evokes powerful emotions for me. So this is beautiful. Is there any story behind this particular image of Du Bois? Oh, excuse me.
That's the question to you.
Okay. So thank you, Debanjan, for that question. Debanjan is a graduate student, my graduate student at UCLA. So yes, there is a story behind this book's cover. The cover is an original commission painting by the artist Charlie Palmer, who is an Atlanta-based fine artist, a children's book illustrator, and my partner. So there's a dozens of beautiful works on Du Bois. But one thing that we noticed in looking at the aesthetics of the production of books on Du Bois, we got like 3 or 4 stock photographs that are kind of iconic to signal Du Bois, and those are always the book covers. And we wanted, Jose and I wanted something that departed from that, but still centered Du Bois's face and the likeness of his image. So we commissioned a piece of fine art for the book cover, and we wanted something that signaled that Du Bois belongs to everyone. So if you notice, there are people on Du Bois's shoulder, and he was speaking to and for everyone who is implicated and oppressed by this global color line. And that was not simply a black and white binary, it was a global binary, and he always understood that. So the image is supposed to be sending that message that Du Bois belonged to the world. Thank you.
Great. Nicole, I think you had a question you mentioned about COVID-19.
Well, I guess, as we're going to, we should probably say that this video, this live broadcast will be posted so we can share it and perhaps have our students also watch this later. But, while we're recording this, we're all on the stay-at-home orders, and certainly the COVID crisis is making us all so aware of pre-existing inequalities that Du Bois would have been concerned about. So one of the things I've been thinking about is, what does it mean to live for sociology today? And by that, I mean, what would Du Bois say about the vocation of sociology? And in these current times, how does this, pandemic reveal how our discipline should change and evolve? What would Du Bois say?
Yeah, sorry. And there is actually a question that's directly linked by Nabila Islam, who says, one of the most interesting outcomes of the global pandemic has been the recent launch of a Socialist International co-signed by Arundhati Roy, Noam Chomsky, and Bernie Sanders, among others. What can we learn from Du Bois' work in global and transnational organizing for the present day? Mm-hmm. So, Jose, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, briefly to Nicole's question, I think that Du Boisian sociology would be, it would be a goal of Du Boisian sociology to try to understand the current moment in a critical way, understanding the institutions and histories that lead to the outcomes that we know. The pandemic in the United States has affected mainly minoritized, poor, and working class people. So understanding, the process that leads to that, understanding how institutions such as the health system works to produce inequalities or profits rather than public health, and understanding how global neoliberalism has affected people, how the pandemic through global neoliberalism has affected people in different parts of the world. And also, Du Boisian sociology would emphasize the need for building solidarity in order to address these inequalities and exclusions as a community and to influence policy making through collective action. So that would be broadly what Du Boisian sociology, would address the pandemics. Regarding global organizing, Du Bois was, from the very beginning involved in the organizations of Pan-African congresses and organizing globally. At the same time that he was organizing here the NAACP, he was organizing Pan-African congresses. He was all the time involved in dialogue and action with anti-colonial thinkers worldwide. So the example of Du Bois and his life is an example of, how to live a life of global organizing. Again, what can we learn at the present moment? Well, if anything, we learn that the present moment, there's nothing more needed than international cooperation and international action, and there's nothing more absent than international cooperation and international action. So, from Du Bois' example and Du Boisian sociology would say, what we need is to create the kind of networks, global networks, through which we can address this pandemic in a humane way, and in a way that does not exacerbate inequalities and exclusion.
Mm.
If I can just get in there and maybe then ask Karida to reply. I mean, when we think about the inequalities today, I mean, clearly the color line is so relevant, but also, of course, gendered differences are very relevant. And I have to say, as a feminist scholar, I'm often quite dismayed at the gender blindness of much mainstream scholarship. So Du Bois was already aware of the significance of gender, and he reflected about it to some extent. But we also know that he did not adequately recognize the contribution of his female contemporaries. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Karida, how do you approach Du Bois's approach to women and gender, both analytically and politically?
Yeah, I approach that by acknowledging that Du Bois was a complex human with many limitations in his greatness, and we cannot, produce a hagiography and put him on a pedestal when it comes to his shortcomings. His engagement with gender, patriarchy, and sexuality was one of his major elisions and shortcomings in his scholarship. So you're absolutely right. He did touch on the structural constraints against women, particularly against Black women. He did pen an essay on that. But he didn't treat gender or sexuality with the attention necessary to make it an emancipatory agenda. That's Du Bois and Du Bois's sociology, what he did. A Du Boisian sociology can pick up the blueprint for what we know about the methodological and analytical frame that he's offered us and take it to the next level and build that scholarship that's necessary for us to understand, critique, and loosen out, get ourselves loosed in this 21st century. So when we talk about, and this is also the case for Du Bois's engagement with the condition of Native and Indigenous peoples, and the particular social relation of settler colonialism. He had very little to say about that. And politically, as you point out, Nadje, he also failed in this area, I would say. He could have easily cited the Black women that he was obviously reading and learning with. It's, littered through his archive that he was in conversation with many women intellectuals and activists of his day. And he could have reached out a hand and shared that platform with them, but he did not for the most part. He also shunned later on in his career his right-hand man, Augustus Granville Dill, when Dill was alleged to be a homosexual. So in these ways, Du Bois certainly fell short, and those are the shortcomings of a complex human, but we choose not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to his system of thought and what it can offer us for an emancipatory sociology.
Right, well, thank you. We have a number of amazing questions. We won't be able to address all of them. I'm just going to read out a couple, and I think I'm just sort of leave them standing, but I think these are things for us to think about. One question by Harleen Kaur: many of us do research on the never-ending state of precarity that our community face, and there are now many new research guides for doing social sciences in precarity during the pandemic. What would Du Bois lead us to think about precarity and returning humanity to our communities in research? And I'd also like to read out another question by Pradeep Kehal, who says, we asked how could we rebuild the discipline, but what of academic labor? Du Bois began as what we would call an adjunct faculty member. What does the pandemic tell us about the nature of our academic labor as sociologists? Now, clearly we don't have the time to address all these questions, but just thanking you all for this amazing conversation, and all of you who listened to us today for the questions that unfortunately we were not able to answer. But I think it just is evidence of the richness of Du Bois's work, and obviously it's very relevant today as we're all struggling to deal not just with the current pandemic, but the underlying historical inequalities that brought us here. And so I'd like to now take the opportunity to thank you, Jose, Karida, and Nicole. I would also like to thank our colleagues in the Watson Institute who facilitated this meeting, and of course, all of you who joined us. We have recorded the session, and in a couple of days, it will be available on the Watson website and as well on the NYU Press website. So I hope those of you who have colleagues and friends who couldn't join us, please spread the news. So thank you very much, and take care and stay healthy and safe.